Story 1. The First Meeting with Kyiv. A City Living Between the Past and the Future. Introduction. Arrival in Kyiv. Stanley Harrison, an American journalist, arrives in Kyiv for a few weeks to explore life in Ukraine after the events of recent years. He wants to understand how the city has changed since independence, two revolutions, and the conflict in the east. From his first steps on Kyiv's soil, he is struck by the mix of historical and modern elements. From ancient churches to glass business centers. It is against this contrast that he meets his first interlocutor, Anna. Chapter 1. Meeting Hannah. Hannah is a 60-year-old Kyivan who was born and raised in the city. She worked as a history teacher in one of the central schools. She immediately agrees to the interview, happy to talk about her city. They meet in a coffee shop in Podol, which offers a great view of Andriivsky descent. The conversation begins with her childhood memories, when the city looked very different. Her childhood in the Soviet Union. Hannah shares her memories of Kyiv in the 1950s and 1960s. She talks about her family, how her grandfather built the city after the Second World War, about walking on Kreshchatik and how Kyiv was a quiet but energetic city. She recalls what Maidan Nezalezhnosti looked like when it was Kalinin Square and how the city celebrated Soviet holidays. The 1991 revolution. Moving on to more recent years, Hannah talks about the early 1990s, when Ukraine gained independence. She recalls the Maidan rallies, how people took to the streets in the hope of a better future, and how life in Kyiv changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Her story is filled with both optimism and anxiety about the future. Modern Kyiv. Hannah shares her vision of modern Kyiv. She talks about the city's development, new buildings, businesses, and how Kyiv is becoming a European metropolis. But she also points out the problems, including pollution, traffic congestion, and the disappearance of historic buildings. Chapter 2. A Walk Through Old Kyiv. Anna invites Stanley to take a walk through Old Kyiv, starting at Andriivsky descent. They walk slowly through the streets, which are filled with art, crafts, and old houses. Hannah tells stories about each house and monument, recalling interesting facts and legends. Andriivsky descent. Hannah describes the history of this famous street where artists, poets, and actors once lived. She talks about Bulgakov's house, the history of St. Andrew's Church, which stands at the top of the descent, and the tradition of holding fairs on this street. Hannah recalls how she used to come here on dates when she was young, how St. Andrew's descent was a center of creativity and freedom. Volodymyr's Hill. During the walk, they climb the Volodymyrska Hill, where a statue of Prince Volodymyr stands. Hannah talks about the history of the baptism of Kyivan Rus and how this place became a symbol of Kyiv's spiritual power. She shares her thoughts on religion in Ukraine and how the church influences the life of the city. Chapter 3. The Revolution of Dignity. Looking back at modern history, Hannah talks about the Revolution of Dignity that took place on the Independence Square in 2013 to 2014. She witnessed these events and shares her memories, which deeply affected her. The beginning of the protests. Hannah describes how it all started with peaceful protests by students in favor of European integration. She recalls the tent city that appeared on the Maidan and how people from all over Ukraine came to support the protesters. The escalation of the conflict. Hannah talks about the tragic events when the confrontation between protesters and security forces escalated into a bloody confrontation. She recalls night clashes, shelling, and fires. These events have left a deep mark on her memory, and she shares how it has affected her life and the lives of her loved ones. The consequences of the revolution. Hannah talks about how the Revolution of Dignity changed Kyiv. She notes that the city has become a symbol of the struggle for freedom and dignity. Hannah expresses her thoughts on how these events affected Ukrainian society, how attitudes towards the state, history, and the future have changed. Chapter 4. Kyiv at War. The conversation turns to the war in eastern Ukraine, which began after the annexation of Crimea and the events in Donbass in 2014. Hannah shares her feelings about these events, especially how they have affected Kyiv and its residents. The impact of the war on the city. Hannah talks about the wave of IDPs who came to Kyiv from Donbass, and how the city became a refuge for those who lost everything because of the war. She recalls the volunteer movement that actively supported the army, and how people helped each other during this difficult time. Life during the war. Hannah talks about how the war forced many people to rethink their lives. She shares the stories of her friends who went to the front, how they returned to Kyiv with injuries, but with an unbreakable spirit. She expresses her hope that Kyiv will remain an outpost of Ukrainian independence and freedom. Chapter 5. Looking to the future. At the end of their walk, Hannah and Stanley sit down on a bench in a Kyiv park. Hannah thinks about the future of Kyiv, about what the city might look like in 10, 20, or 50 years. Preservation of history. Hannah expresses her hope that Kyiv will be able to preserve its historical heritage despite the development of modern technology and urbanization. She talks about the importance of preserving monuments and how important it is to remember your roots. City development. Hannah dreams of Kyiv becoming a true European city where high technology coexists harmoniously with history. She talks about the need to improve the infrastructure, environment, and social conditions so that the city can become a better place for future generations. A legacy for young people. Hannah shares her thoughts on the youth of Kyiv, who must take up the baton and continue to develop the city. She urges them to remember the importance of history and the value of freedom and democracy, which they have gained at such a high price. Conclusion. Kyiv as a symbol of resilience. Stanley concludes his story about his first encounter with Kyiv. He reflects on the fact that this city is not just a place on a map, but a living organism that lives between the past and the future. He sees Kyiv as a symbol of resilience, strength, and will to live, which has survived numerous challenges and continues to move forward, leaving a mark on history. Chapter 6. Kyiv's contrasts. Stanley continues his exploration of the city, focusing on its contrasts. He meets different people, each with their own perspective on how Kyiv is changing and what it means to them. Alina, a young entrepreneur. Stanley meets Alina, who has recently started a business in one of the new business centers in Lukyanivka. She talks about her experience of doing business in Ukraine, the challenges and prospects. Alina shares her vision of the city's future, believing that Kyiv is becoming more and more open to the world and can become a true center of innovation. At the same time, she notes that the city faces old problems, such as corruption and bureaucracy, which hinder development. Alexei, a factory worker. Next to the modern businesses, Stanley meets Alexei, a worker at a Kyiv factory. Alexei works for a company that has been around since the Soviet era and is currently going through a difficult time. He talks about the difficulties faced by workers in old industries in the new economic environment. Alexei discusses how difficult it is to preserve traditions while adapting to new realities. The contrast between the new and the old. In his conversations with Alina and Alexei, Stanley sees a reflection of the changes taking place in Kyiv. The city balances between modernization and preservation of traditions, between the old industrial past and the new technologies of the future. Chapter 7. Street art and youth culture. Kyiv is not only about history and business, but also about youth culture, which is gaining momentum and shaping a new image of the city. A mural on Lesia Ukrainka Boulevard. Walking around the city, Stanley notices many murals, modern wall paintings that adorn buildings in different parts of Kyiv. He meets one of the artists who created the mural on Lesia Ukrainka Boulevard. The young artist talks about how street art has become a reflection of a new wave of cultural development in the city, a symbol of freedom and self-expression. Kyiv youth. Stanley spends time with young Kyiv residents who share their dreams and aspirations. They talk about festivals, concerts, and the city's nightlife. The young people of Kyiv are enthusiastic and see their city as a place for ideas, creative projects, and cultural change. Stanley is impressed by their energy and belief in the future. Chapter 8. City problems and solutions. Not everything in Kyiv is perfect. Stanley encounters the issues that concern the city's residents and explores how they affect their lives. Pollution and the environment. Kyiv, like many other big cities, faces the problem of air and water pollution. Stanley meets with an environmentalist who tells him about the main sources of pollution and what can be done to improve the environmental situation. They discuss the problem of traffic congestion, old cars, and the lack of green spaces in the city. The state of the city's infrastructure. Stanley meets an engineer who is working on upgrading Kyiv's infrastructure. The engineer talks about the difficulties of repairing old water supply and heating systems that have remained since the Soviet era. He also shares his plans to modernize public transport, build new metro stations, and expand the road network. Corruption and bureaucracy. Stanley talks to an activist who is fighting corruption in Kyiv. The activist shares his frustrations with the pace of reform, but also talks about the small victories he has won. They discuss how corruption affects the daily lives of Kyiv residents, business development, and the image of the city in the eyes of foreigners. Chapter 9. Kyiv Holidays and Traditions. Despite the challenges, Kyiv residents preserve their traditions and cultural customs, which are passed down from generation to generation. Ivan Kapala Holiday. Stanley has the opportunity to attend the midsummer celebrations on Trukhanov Island. He learns about the ancient rituals associated with water and fire, and how they reflect the harmony of man with nature. Hannah, who also joined the celebrations, talks about the significance of this holiday for Ukrainians and its connection to ancient pagan traditions. Christmas in Kyiv. Stanley stays in Kyiv for Christmas and sees how the city changes for the holiday. He visits Sofia Square, where the Christmas tree is set up, and learns about Ukrainian Christmas traditions. Carols, nativity scenes, and festive food. Hannah shares her memories of how she celebrated Christmas as a child and how these traditions have survived to this day. Chapter 10. The Future of Kyiv, an inside look. At the end of his time in Kyiv, Stanley reflects on what he has seen and experienced. He meets with a city planner who is working on a strategy for Kyiv's development over the next decades. Plans for the future. The city planner talks about projects that will change the face of Kyiv in the coming years. He talks about the development of new districts, the construction of eco-friendly residential complexes, improving transport infrastructure, and creating new public spaces. Stanley understands that Kyiv is on the verge of major changes that could significantly affect its character. Final thoughts. Stanley concludes his story by reflecting on how Kyiv maintains a balance between the past and the future. He sees something special in this city, a soul that does not disappear even in the most difficult times. For him, Kyiv becomes a symbol of strength, endurance, and faith in a better future, built on a solid foundation of history and culture. If you are interested in stories, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss interesting stories from Storytelling World.